Thanks everyone for being here. I'm so excited. My name is Terrence Samuel. I am the 2025 Sacca Family Fellow in Religion and International Journalism at the Berkeley Center. And today we are going to talk about something that I think is both timeless and I couldn't be more urgent in the moment, which is kind of the relationship between our politics and religion and how they kind of shape each other. And the fact that we even think about them separately is, I think, part of the reason we're going to end up talking about why they are so intertwined. We have with us two people who I describe as kind of two of the smartest people I know. You guys got a little taste of that already. I don't know if Sarah McCammon is a national political reporter at NPR and the author of
The Ex-Evangelicals.
The Ex-Evangelicals. Do the subtitle.
Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Oh, look at you. Thank you.
Terrific reading. And she doesn't remember this, but the first story I edited of hers, I think maybe the only story I edited of hers, was the Justin Fairfax story where you were running around Central Virginia after a gubernatorial candidate who was going to have to leave the race because of sexual misconduct. And
allegations. Sorry.
Allegations.
Yes.
We are very careful. I am less so now. But I had come from newspapers, and this show was going on at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and I filed a piece at 10 minutes of 5, and the executive producer lost her mind. She just lost her mind. She's like, "Do you know how shows work?" I was like, "Well, obviously no." I just got here.
Was that my piece? Was it
Yes.
my piece that you edited? Oh.
Yeah, you were completely, totally cool. She lost him.
Whoops.
James is most recently the executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter. We worked together at the Washington Post for a very short time. I got there. He left and went to the Wall Street Journal. Did a lot of, obviously, straight-ahead politics. And when I called him to ask him to do this, I said, we who covered politics thought about it as, that was a serious work, and the religion coverage was kind of separate and lesser so. And he's like, "I never thought that." And I was like, "All right, good. We're gonna have a discussion." In any case, this started with the idea that we're in this moment where facts don't seem to matter, and politics has gotten so intense and divided and so devoid of fact. I mean, for journalists, I think it's been very difficult to see all this really good work, factual, hard-hitting work, come to nothing because it just doesn't matter as much, in my mind, as it used to. And we'll hear a lot about that. But then it was like, in some ways, I thought, our politics has gotten, it's almost like a religious war. And the more I thought about it, and the more I think about it, it in fact is nothing new. And I think you will hear from both of them how it's always been, in some ways, religion has always been political, and politics has always been so very closely tied to religion. I'm going to start with Sarah. Talk a little bit about kind of covering this latest campaign, having written the book that you wrote, and coming out of 2016 where you had this kind of like stark realization that essentially your tribe was at the center of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to go back first to something you just said, Terry, and I think it's really important to remember that what we are trying to do here in the US, this pluralistic secular democracy, is I mean, I think we all know this, but I don't think we can say it enough. It's really unusual in human history. And, you know, we fret about religion and politics being intertwined, and we should, because we have a pluralistic democracy that's supposed to be secular and for everyone. But I think the force of history is really powerful. And, you know, this isn't, I don't mean this as a moral or religious or spiritual statement, but just sort of historically speaking, Europe has been dominantly Christian, right? Because of forces, you know, you can go back to Constantine, right? The intertwining of religion and politics goes way back. Most of the Middle East is officially Muslim. It's rare for a country to be secular, and I think that, you know, I sort of have this personal theory that we have this sort of embedded, almost like collective memory of you know, the power of religion in our politics. And so some people cynically weaponize and harness religion for political or power purposes, you know, in pursuit of power, and others, I think, genuinely believe what they believe and want to inject that into the public conversation, and then there's a mix of both. But to Terry's point a moment ago, you know, I wrote my book, The Ex-Evangelicals, because I grew up in, you know, what a lot of us called the evangelical bubble in the Midwest in the 1980s and 90s, at a time when the moral majority was coming into power, and at a time when I think, you know, the broader public was kind of just starting to realize the political power of the conservative Christian right. For me, it was the world I lived in. I, you know, as an adult, kind of stepped away from that in many ways, went into journalism because I don't think I was conscious of it at the time, but I was just drawn to sort of this independent space where everybody could sort of come together and debate ideas, and, you know, sort of as a reflection of that secular democracy, have public debates that were for everyone, and I was attracted to that kind of space for inquiry and discovery and curiosity. And then I did find myself assigned to the 2016 Republican primary and covering the Trump campaign, and really covering so many of the themes that had shaped my childhood. And so for many years after that, people who knew me would ask about what I sort of saw as someone with that personal history in that professional role, and the book emerged from me trying to answer that question. And I think, you know, just to go back to your last question, in 2024, I think my short summation of it is that not that much has changed. You know, in 2016, the big question on a lot of people's minds was, would the evangelical right that had been so concerned about, at least ostensibly concerned about character and moral values, you know, back in the 1990s during the Clinton era, would that movement that was so essential to the Republican Party support someone like Donald Trump? And the resounding answer was yes, and that hasn't changed, is the bottom line.
James, you covered a big election.
I did.
Recently. And this one came with smoke at the end.
That's correct. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about kind of the big story being the election of Pope Leo against the backdrop of 2024, 2016, and kind of the Trump America dynamic that...
Yeah, pretty interesting backdrop for sure. There's so much to say with that question. I could talk for probably an hour just thinking about it. Let's just start with some recent developments. The election of the U.S. the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which was Archbishop Coakley of Oklahoma. That is actually that may seem very narrow to some of you, but some of you may be familiar. If you look at that election, which was 128 to 109, it was actually kind of a mirror of the political dynamics in the United States today with American Catholics, in which there is a major divide between conservative Catholics and progressive Catholics. And by a slight margin there, 54%, the conservative Catholics were able to elect Archbishop Coakley. And what's interesting about that is that he represents the more hesitant, Trump-friendlier part of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Slow to criticize the Trump administration for the mass deportation. They did issue a statement at the end of the conference at the behest of Pope Leo, who basically had to drag them kicking and screaming into releasing that very document, which the Pope just last night endorsed and praised. And if you haven't seen that video, it's for me kind of a joy to be able to listen to my Pope speak with a Chicago accent in English for the first time in my life, the first time in anyone's life, and for him to endorse basic Catholic social teaching is pretty interesting. Going into the conclave, there was very significant moneyed conservative, we'll call them Republican, Trumpy interests that were trying to nudge the conclave into a direction for a much more conservative pope. Their candidates included Cardinal Burke and Cardinal Sarah of Africa, who is very anti-LGBT, and I think believes in imprisoning, I think he may be from a country where they imprison those who identify as gay, versus, the kind of Pope Francis wing of the Catholic Party, we'll call it that. Now, let me just talk a little bit about the politics. American politics are not the same as Catholic politics, right? So when we talk about the ethic of life, from conception to natural death, that would be the Catholic point of view, where you see, I believe, many American conservatives agreeing with that is sort of basically through, conception until they enter the country of the United States illegally, at which point the ethic of life means you can separate children from their parents. You can arrest people, as the Pope said last night, who have been in the country, perhaps illegally, for 10, 15, and 20 years, while working, paying taxes, living in the country fine, breaking up their families, taking them out of, taco stands in Ohio, as reported today's front page of the Wall Street Journal, which is causing some problems in that town in Ohio. And simply separating families. So just so as you understand the dynamic between the Catholic Church and that, what I think you're seeing also is a number of Catholics in the administration who are very much behind these anti-immigrant policies, which is of major concern, I will say. And let's be honest, not only because it's part of their flock, but it's the future of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church cannot live really or survive without, many of basically it's with the Latinos and Hispanics.
So you make the point that American politics is not Catholic politics. People would say evangelical politics is probably more American politics. That's not what we would have said in 1960. But both of you, talk a little bit about when you kind of came to the realization that your religious background, your community, was so prominent and significant in kind of the larger politics that we're doing.
People have made the argument that evangelicalism is, if there's any kind of default American religion, it's evangelicalism now. It once was maybe mainline Protestantism. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly pervasive. And evangelical is such a squishy label and a contested label. It can kind of mean anything. And I think people within the movement often feel frustrated that it's applied to so many people. And I think, fair enough. But for me, if we're talking about sort of the political piece of evangelicalism, I think it became clear to me only as an adult how powerful the conservative Christian right was. Again, because, like anyone, whatever you grew up around is just normal to you. And there was this narrative within the evangelical movement at the time of sort of being embattled and at war with the world. There was a lot of drawing on biblical language about spiritual battles, but it was applied to sort of culture war, political fights. And so we had this sense of sort of being this embattled minority, even though, arguably when I was a child, we were the largest religious group in the country. I think one of the big differences between evangelical politics, not to say that all evangelicals agree, but if you look at polling, about 80% of them voted for Trump. And if you look at mainline Protestants, it's more like 55, 60. Catholics, I think, are similar ballpark, maybe around 50, a little over half. White, we're talking about white Christians here, because if you overlay race, it gets more complicated. But point being, evangelicals are much more uniformly Republican, pro-Trump than any other white Christian group in the country. But I think one big difference is that in Catholicism, there's at least this goal, right, of unity, of church unity. So you're going to, within a community that's that large and trying to be cohesive, you're going to intrinsically, I think, have some difference. Whereas in Protestantism, what you do when you have differences, you just split. And so you get, the evangelical movement is one major sort of sect within Protestantism and within larger Christianity. And so people tend to sort of self-sort by not just theology, but also politics, I think.
Well, that happened a few hundred years ago on the other side, too.
Yeah. So, well, to answer your question, I identify as an Italian Catholic, right? That's sort of my background. And, for me,
Of course, the Irish Catholic.
I have Irish in me as well. So it's Irish on the mother's side, and my grandparents were born in Italy. And I can tell you, growing up, when did you first see as a connection? I would say John F. Kennedy, of course, was elected when I was an infant. Or I guess he was 2 years before I was born. But even growing up, all of the politicians, and my parents were somewhat political, they were supported, all happened to be Catholic. Well, no, I don't think it just happened to be. They were all Catholic, right? And in Missouri at that time, they tended to be Democrats, but more and more as they got older, they really identified as Republican, because they were very conservative on big issues, and they were very pro-life sort of going forward. In my career as a journalist, I just always, it's just sort of a part of me, it's the way you're raised. I identify that as part of who I am, right? When I got into journalism, you learn, of course, that you separate, your feelings and your personal beliefs, and you set those aside. You can't make campaign contributions. You don't have support for any particular candidates. You basically have to be monk-like in terms of your approach to politics. But I would always write about it whenever I came across it. I first started really doing more political coverage at the Orange County Register, and I remember where I wrote a whole story about Arianna Huffington, who was Michael Huffington's wife at the time, and he was running for Senate against Dianne Feinstein. She was really trying to lure the conservative Christians in Orange County, a very conservative county where I worked for the Orange County Register. Yet at the same time, I was able to uncover $60,000 that she had given to what some described as a cult, in which was founded by a guy named John Roger, who taught his followers that he was the reincarnation of Abraham, Isaac, Jesus Christ, and a few others. I can't remember.
All at the same time?
Mohammed. Yeah, he had done all of them.
Wow.
Pretty impressive, really. And a very interesting place to make her contribution. So that ended up being kind of a political story. It was somewhat damaging for their efforts at trying to recruit the conservative Christian vote in that particular race. And then it came into everything that I did. I always looked at where the money came from. I followed the Christian Coalition. When I did the Jack Abramoff scandal with Sue Schmidt and Jeff Smith that won the Pulitzer in 2006, one of the big players, two of the biggest players in that were Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition, who laundered money for Jack Abramoff, and a guy named Lucky Louie, Lou Sheldon. They called him Lucky Louie, who was a conservative Christian who basically was for hire. You could hire Lucky Louie at any time, and he would sort of be part of your campaign. And he also laundered some money in that regard as well. So I always found that that probably beginning with Falwell and the Christian Coalition and that crowd always had become very involved, in campaigns since, I guess, going back into the 80s.
I mean, one of the things I think people get weird about is how political evangelicals are, and that is somehow a demerit. That's not what devout people are supposed to be doing, particularly when they end up on, the side of Donald Trump. I did hear Sarah explain why this was rational for some people, in that, God uses flawed people all the time. And so Trump is, but should we be surprised at all that people are willing to use political means to get what they want?
Well, I mean, it doesn't just happen on the right. There's a long tradition of Democratic politicians campaigning in churches that are aligned with them as well. Right. I think that's important to keep in mind. You can argue about who does it more or worse or whatever, but it happens across the political spectrum. I think evangelicals are particularly numerous and have been particularly effective at because of people like Ralph Reed and others, at harnessing that white Christian vote. And you could talk about why, but I don't think it's unique to the evangelical movement.
And so is it an unfair criticism because everybody does it, or is there something about the way we would like to conduct our religious life that says this is somehow a little bit taboo? Or is that just American?
Well, go ahead.
Are you talking about the cognitive dissonance between religion and politics, that people are able to vote for perhaps someone who has unchristian policies while still exhibiting, practicing the faith, or?
Yes, there's that, but I was getting more at the idea that some people think that it is cognitive dissonance. I mean, should it be?
I think we need to I think religion is important in politics, but I will say that I believe that if you look at the results of the election that elected Donald Trump, it had everything to do with pocketbook issues more than anything else. It reminds me of sort of what E.J. Dionne kind of coined the phrase, there is no Catholic vote, and it matters more than ever. And if you go back and you read that original column, which I think could be 20 years old, and he keeps talking about it, and we did a poll, and the first thing I did when I got to NCR in September, I said we're going to do a poll of Catholics in swing states, and I went to Jerry Seib, who's also a Catholic, worked a long time political writer for the Wall Street Journal and still around town. He said, well, he really believes there is no Catholic vote. Well, we did this poll of the swing state voters of the Catholic vote, who we were able to identify, and we had a great pollster who helped us with it. Well, basically, it mirrored the outcome of the election in the state. It was not different than the outcome. By the way, we predicted every state correctly with that poll, which is interesting. So, and it reminded me also, I happened to be in Rome in October, and I sat down with one of the cardinals, who I won't name, but later was actually one of the cardinals who revealed and announced the death of Pope Francis. So someone very, very very smart political guy in the Vatican, in the Holy See, and he said, well, I can still remember him looking at me saying, Americans are just going to vote their pocketbook anyway. I think he was right. I mean, from his viewpoint in Rome. So, you talk about like, well, does this matter? Trump has been accused of rape. He probably went to the rape island with Epstein. But then again, look at the guy who ran for attorney general in Virginia, the Democrat who just won, and what he had written about it.
Jay Jones.
He which would in 10 years ago would have been disqualifying. And now this year he won, not the same margin as Spanberger, but he still won by a margin. So I think, I'm beginning to think that the Americans don't care about the religious beliefs of the candidate anymore, or maybe even care about their personal lives or their odious opinions, as we saw in that AG race.
I mean, religion, whether or not it's persuasive, it's a good marketing and coalition building tool. I think in every election since maybe 2008, people like Ralph Reed have been specifically targeting not just evangelical voters, but conservative Catholics who are aligned ideologically, and churches are a really effective way to find those people. And I mean, for example, Reed's group was putting brochures in churches, and does that violate IRS rules? Does it violate separation of church and state? I think the answer legally is no if it's done a certain way. And some of these groups have gotten really, really good at building relationships with pastors, getting their materials into churches, connecting with basically influencers in the religious world. And I think it's harder for Democrats to do that because their movement is a bit more diffuse. It's more secular, and so churches are just kind of like a built-in trusted network of people who share some values. And the Republican Party in particular has been very effective at sort of persuading a lot of those voters that their values align with these voters' religious values.
Well, I think Democrats just do it slightly differently, particularly in the black churches. You won't find a presidential candidate successful if he's not, the Clintons famously would always go to the black churches every Sunday the month before an election. And you'll see that, Clyburn or whoever in South Carolina, that's where their base is. So I think it's probably just of a different kind.
I agree. And to your bigger, I think I'm getting at your question, Terry, and tell me if I'm not, but about sort of this alignment or conflation
you got 3:30.
of religion and politics, whether or not they should be intertwined like that. I get asked a lot about Christian nationalism. Like, what is it? How do you define it? And I'm not a scholar of Christian nationalism, but I read a lot of people who are. And I think one of the really important distinctions is, I don't think most reasonable people are asking voters not to bring their moral values and beliefs, whether they be, Catholic social justice values or conservative anti-abortion, evangelical values or something else. I don't think anyone's asking them not to consider those deeply held beliefs when they vote or when they form their political views. But the scholars I pay attention to when it comes to Christian nationalism, I think would argue that the distinction is, do you see your faith, your version of your faith, as somehow deserving of privilege and some kind of special status in America, or perhaps as some sort of intrinsic component of being a true American? Do you need to be a Christian to be an American? Is a true American a Christian, and does Christianity deserve some kind of special place of privilege? To me, that's, I think, a pretty good dividing line.
So we were talking about all the things you couldn't do as a reporter. You don't give money, you don't go to... You went out and wrote a book about separating yourself from this, not just religious community, but this hugely important political community. Talk about what that has been like.
Mm-hmm. Well, you won't find me expressing any specific political beliefs in the book. Each chapter is sort of organized around a theme of what I would call cognitive dissonance that I experienced, and I also interview a lot of other people who found themselves, in the last 10 years or so, having conversations about what it meant to be an evangelical. And, I never wanted the book to be only about politics, partly because, as a journalist, I don't take political positions. But I was, as I said, in this kind of unique position of covering a movement and its power that I had, I didn't choose to be part of, but I was born into. And I thought I had some things to say about that. So what I tried to really do is what I try to do all the time as a journalist, which is as much as possible show and describe. I quoted a lot of experts. I quoted a lot of other people who'd walked similar paths. And I never say Trump is good or bad, or you should be a Republican or a Democrat, and I would never do that. I mean, it was a delicate balance, and I consulted ethics people at NPR about before I did it. But I think,
I can confirm.
I was getting so many questions about, what do you see? And a lot of it was just like, explain the evangelical movement. Because a lot of outsiders will look at Trump and look at evangelical values and say, how is this possible? Like, how can evangelical voters align with someone like this? And so one of the reasons I wrote the book is I just kind of wanted to, in a really textured, granular way, explain how this came to be and what it felt like from the inside. So a lot of it is just descriptive.
Yeah. But
at least that was the objective.
The act of announcing that you had left was not.
Well, I hadn't identified as an evangelical for like at least 10 years when I started working at NPR, and I think I make pretty clear in the book that it wasn't expressly a political decision. Right. It was about much more. In fact, the main character in the book in many ways is my grandfather, who came out as gay late in life. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be here. That's complicated. But he came out around the age 60, and my relationship with him really forced me to think a lot about what I thought about the teachings of the church community I'd grown up in. I mean, is that a political issue? Sure, but the way I talk, it is in the sense that gay marriage was once contested. Right. It's pretty much settled now, it looks like. But I felt pretty comfortable talking about that because I think that's an issue. Again, I was talking about it really just my own experience, right. What it was like to discover that my grandpa was gay, and in a family where that was seen as sinful and unacceptable. And so I really tried to tell the story through those personal experiences as opposed to through a primarily political lens.
James, can you talk a little bit about how journalism feels different to you now than when you got into it 100 years before I did?
Well, I liked what you were saying. I mean, I agree with what you were saying sort of at the beginning. I mean, it seems like 30 times a month there is a scandal out of the Trump administration that back in the day would have been a scandal for a year. Right. And we would write stories. I spent 2 years looking at Hillary Clinton before she ran for president, and the donations to the Clinton Foundation and that were being made around the time that she was Secretary of State. Now we've got a president, and go read those. I think they were pretty good stories that held her accountable for what seemed to be ethical violations. Now we have a president of the United States who appears to have his children accepting emoluments from Saudi Arabia while they're, selling jets and embracing, someone whose country slaughtered and dismembered a Washington Post journalist in a Turkish embassy, which apparently our intelligence agency said that the prince knew about. What is a quid pro quo? As James Thurber always used to say, proving the quid and proving the quo were easy. The pro, quid pro quo, the pro was always the hardest point, but who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I mean, it doesn't even seem like it's an issue.
What do you think has happened? Do we just have a different, lower standard as a society? Is the journalism just less effective?
I don't think the journalism is less effective. I do think there's a fire hose of, I don't know, what do you want to call it? A fire hose of something coming out that is hard to keep track of. But I think it's being, a fire hose of corruption, perhaps. There's so much that's coming out. I do think that journalists are doing a very good job. I feel like the public seems to be inured to it, seem to be cynical about it. I think there's a sense that all politicians are corrupt. And therefore, sure, that's what everyone has done. He's just doing it out in the open. We talked about cognitive dissonance. Maybe it's more willful ignorance than cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I mean, when I started covering politics nationally a decade ago, and even earlier at the local level, a lot of what drove me in my work was curiosity, like just really wanting to understand what made people tick, how they made up their minds, how they decided which values took priority when some of them were in conflict, and there was a ton of that to sort through in 2016. I'm a lot less interested in it now. I find it a lot less, I feel like there's just so much less to try to discover because it's just been so many years now of, I think, increasing divisiveness, increasing polarization, increasingly muddy information. The information is coming at us from so many different sources, and I think, I do when I talk to voters now. I think I used to sort of naively believe that, well, I can get to the bottom of some kind of coherent ethic or ideology that's driving people's decisions, and I don't think that things necessarily cohere as much as maybe we want them to. I mean, I think this question of how can a voter who says they believe in X support someone who does Y? It just doesn't compute for a lot of people anymore. I think part of it is that they have so much information coming at them, and they're trying to synthesize it, and they don't know who to believe, and they don't trust the press anymore, and they don't trust institutions. And so I think a lot of it is just vibes. And it gets really difficult to try to say something about vibes.
So you still have this job.
I do.
So you got to go do it.
Yeah.
What is the point of all this reporting and all these facts and all these interviews and?
No, I struggle with this more and more. I'm being honest here. Because I don't think there's always an answer to those questions. I think a lot of it is sometimes voting is just expressing rage and fear and unhappiness, and it's not much more.
I think it's very personal. I think it's like I really do believe it's a pocketbook issue, and I believe the reason that the Democrats won so overwhelmingly in both Virginia and in New Jersey. Of course, they were blue states, they were Democratic states, but by a margin way more than expected is because the economy's gone into the crapper under Trump. And, let's just be honest about it. The inflation has not gone down as he promised, and the largest peacetime tax increase in American since World War II, also known as import taxes, also known as tariffs, is having a devastating effect on the economy. And so I think people are voting their pocketbooks these days. I think they're looking more internally about how is this person going to affect me? And it looks grim for the midterms for the Republicans, but we shall see. It's a long time away from here.
But they weren't feeling good in 2024, and it's part of why a lot of younger voters, said they moved toward Trump. Even young voters of color who, 10 years ago we never would have predicted that.
Inflation was a real issue
because of economic issues, and I think just a despair that the system will ever work for them.
The Democrats tried to do the Jedi mind game. It's not what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to change the title of this talk from religion and politics to religion and economics, starting now.
Oh, okay, good.
Talk a little bit about, so we addressed the future of American politics part of the promise. You live in Virginia. You were there for all of the craziness of the last month or so. What does this portend for 2026? I'm embarrassed to do this.
What does it portend? I mean, I think still economics are going to be the big issue. All signs point in that direction. The poll said that leading up to 24. They said that this year. I think the results bore that out. All the Democratic strategists I talked to across the spectrum of the Democratic Party a couple weeks ago said, regardless of whether you like Spanberger or Mamdani and think that's the future of the party, they all were talking about economic issues, housing, healthcare, the cost of living, and that's what voters are concerned about. And now we hear Trump trying to pivot on that, talk about it a little bit more too, and promising to talk about it more in the future. So, barring some kind of huge economic rebound, I mean, I think a lot of the issues that especially are challenging for younger voters are not going away. Like, I don't think we're going to build a massive amount of new housing in the next 10 months or something. And so that one's not going away. It's hard to see regression in prices. I think it'll be a contest for both parties to try to make the case to voters that they can do something about it. Obviously, Republicans are in power, so they have a harder hill to climb there, it looks like.
I want to go back to the topic that we were talking about. Actually,
you want to go back to religion?
I wanted to point out one reason why I think people are not paying attention. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it began sort of when we saw The Dark Side of Camelot, and then we saw Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. I mean, I think those were kind of turning points in terms of people saying, our leaders, are flawed individuals, we're all sinners. Therefore, they'll set aside sort of really maybe some of these personal problems in order to sort of looking at the policy. So I just wanted to throw that out.
And Trump just falls in line with that history.
Yes, in fact, I think he saw how Clinton survived. I mean, he was friendly with the Clintons. I think he saw how Clinton survived that and figured that, well, I can survive anything. And he made that comment about shooting someone, on 6th Avenue or whatever. And I think, in some ways, like I said, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General, it's the same sort of thing.
So is this the end of the culture wars?
No. We're in the middle of them, and they're getting worse. I mean, we talked a little bit about Christian nationalism. I think we also have Catholic nationalism that's sort of developing, and I think we're seeing it also in our administration. We have a vice president, who is a converted Catholic, but who's sort of embracing the hard right and sending his sons to an Opus Dei school. We have members of the cabinet who are sort of embracing the harshes of the harsh policies. I think there are more Catholics in this administration than almost any that I could think of.
All converts, though.
What's that?
All converts.
Not all of them, but a lot of them. Yeah.
Do the converts tend to be more conservative?
Yes, they do. In fact, I think that's why they often are embraced. They embrace the Catholicism, and I think they feel like it gives them a greater meaning for many of their very conservative views. And I kind of feel like that's where Vance is. Those of us who are cradle Catholics, do we have many cradle Catholics in here? Those of us who are cradle Catholics, you know what I'm talking about.
What is the line? The zeal of a convert?
Well, it's just,
Yes.
I mean, like I don't know. I don't want to feel like I'm creating some sort of division, but they could be a little bit more intense, a little bit more righteous, a little bit more self-righteous. So I think there's a little bit
And you
of that.
overlay that with their politics, and it's not surprising.
Yeah.
I'm just, as somebody who went to Catholic school, the idea that you would want a more strict Catholic school is just shocking to me. But, but okay. Where are we? Should we?
We could do questions, right?
We can do that.
I'm sure there are people here waiting.
That's
waiting.
what I was.
waiting to ask questions. We've, scared off a couple people.
Yeah, it's all the talk about economics.
While you guys are thinking of questions, I could tell one more story about the attempts to influence the conclave.
Yes, please.
A couple of anecdotes. So Brian Birch was the founder of Catholic Vote. Catholic Vote spent upwards of $10 million to get Trump elected. He was then nominated to be the ambassador to the Vatican. It was one of the very first things that Trump did was to say he was going to make him the ambassador to the Holy See. While I was at covering the conclave, in the right. So the way the conclave works is, the conclave. The part is when they go in and they're in the Sistine Chapel and we're waiting for the smoke. But where the real work is done is actually during the congregations the week before. So you basically, the Pope is dead, you bury him about 8 days later, and then there's a week of these meetings, and everyone gets a chance to speak, everyone, was it 300 members of the College of Cardinals, or
Did you talk to all of them?
80. We interviewed a lot of them. And I accurately predicted Prevost was the top candidate on CBS News. I have the video if you want to see it. I was an outlier, but I was right. They have these congregations, and during that period of time, Catholic Vote decided to start getting into the news business, in which they reported a story that one of the leading candidates, Cardinal Parolin, who's the Secretary of State, who is not a favorite of the conservatives because he was the one on behalf of Francis cut a controversial deal with the People's Republic of China in terms of appointing the prelates in China. So it's a long and complicated story, and we even had a story about Nancy Pelosi criticizing that as well. She's a big China hawk, and she didn't like that deal either. So a story came out on the Catholic Vote website that said Parolin collapsed and was rushed to the hospital by ambulance, and it was not true. And it was denied in the Holy See press room, and it was like an amazing scene. The question was in Italian, and
They just made it up?
Well, they blamed the Italian media, and with a link to the Italian media, and the Italian media blamed Catholic Vote, saying, we never had that story. We were never able to get to the bottom of it, but it looked like a way to try to tank a candidate they didn't like. Also, there were these dossiers that were going out to the cardinals, trying to get them to support these conservative candidates, which is why we did our own database that was fact-based, we looked at the positions of every member of the College of Cardinals on 10 key positions, from the Latin Mass to, blessing gay unions, just a blessing of a gay couple, to, embracing synodality for those Catholic geeks in the room who know what synodality is. We did 10 issues. We had a database. You could look and see who was what. And when we looked at that, synodality is a big Pope Francis thing where they want to be more inclusive and having the congregation, people being involved in sort of the church. When we looked at that, we realized that more than 100 of 180 of the voters had embraced that. We said, we're going to have someone who's going to embrace synodality and who's going to be probably to toe the line of Francis, maybe with a little bit of a tonal difference. And we were right. That's exactly what happened. So these conservative efforts to try to influence the College of Cardinals backfired, but they did try to do it.
And they tried to do it by pretending to be news media.
Yeah.
Part of what we started with this idea of, does religion reporting have anything to teach political reporting? I feel like the question is now, do religious campaigns have anything to teach political campaigns? Because that was...
Well, that's an interesting question.
Pretty
well,
nasty.
there was campaigning, but it's. I treated it like an election because I've covered elections. So from my day one, when I started, I said there are 180 members of the College of Cardinals. We're going to do a database on every one of them. And my wife said, oh, you need to do little baseball cards. So we had little baseball cards, so you could click on it, would pop up with their name, where they were born, what, a little bio about them, their background, and then we had these 10 positions and what their positions on them. But most of this is done in kind of the old-fashioned way. Before we had direct elections in these countries, it was in smoke-filled rooms, back rooms, so they would have coffees or dinners or what have you. And it was not necessarily by party line, but there was definitely, I feel, a coalition behind Prevost, who became Pope Leo. There were others who were behind some others who were not able to gather it. And you have to look at, this was very important, is geography. So during the Francis papacy, the number of cardinals from the global north to the global south expanded significantly. We have fewer cardinals in the United States than we did, I think, when,
And yet we end up with an American Pope.
Who spent most of his life in Peru. And actually, most of his life not in the United States. He was in Peru or in Rome or around the world. So, yes, we did. Isn't that interesting?
But he is tainted because he is a Cubs fan?
No.
White Sox fan.
He's
Sox
a White
fan,
Sox
isn't he? Yeah.
fan.
White Sox fan.
His mother was a Cubs fan.
I'm just
See how
thinking,
excited we get when we mention the whole baseball.
I'm just thinking how different Protestantism is, because if you don't like the leadership of the church, you just go start another one, ad infinitum. So.
Well, some
guys
of
are
us
awesome.
still believe in one holy Catholic
I
and
know.
Apostolic Church.
I know.
We say it every day. Questions?
This is primarily for Ms. McCammon. First, thank you all for being here, and it's really wonderful for me to get to see this niche. I listen to you on NPR all the time, so it's really nice to be able to
Sarah.
see you. But I was curious in your reporting and in your research. Do you see at all any kind of shift within the evangelical political coalition, as Donald Trump is sort of now like a lame duck president, or is transitioning into a lame duck president, and the MAGA movement is kind of looking at what comes next? Obviously, there's been some talk of J.D. Vance, who, as a more conservative Catholic, could potentially take over those reins, but I was just curious as to what you've seen out in the field when it comes to the future, perhaps, of the evangelicals in the Republican Party.
I think people who still identify as evangelical have, by and large, I mean, the exit polls bear out that they still align largely with Trump, and I think have made peace with whatever his, character flaws or whatever term you want to use for it are. Terry alluded to it, but I have heard many times over the years the idea that God can use broken vessels, flawed people. This idea, I think, sort of emerged early on in 2016, and I still hear it today. Sometimes there will be biblical figures pointed out who were flawed, as an example, and then I think it fundamentally becomes sort of a pragmatic decision. People will say, well, I align with the Republican Party and Trump on all of these issues and not with the Democratic Party, so that's who I'm going to support. And yes, all politicians are corrupt, and so it doesn't really matter. I hear that too. I think, based on some of my conversations with sociologists of religion and just looking at some of the data, it seems like people who increasingly evangelical feels like a political label. And so people who don't share the sort of political project will call themselves something else. They'll just call themselves Christian, or maybe they'll split off and go to a mainline Protestant church, or and there is about 20% of the evangelical movement that still doesn't identify with the MAGA movement, and those people exist too.
I want to ask you a question. So do you think that being a Catholic would hurt him among evangelicals?
That Vance being a Catholic? I haven't seen any polling on that, and it's a really interesting question.
Because you make a reference to that in your book, which I saw. I mean, a lot of evangelicals are very suspicious of Catholics?
Right. I think, it's a really interesting question. Like, a lot of evangelicals were uncomfortable with Romney being a Mormon back in 2012, but they're not uncomfortable with Trump being, a lapsed Presbyterian maybe.
Yeah.
And so I think it's more about ideology than religion. I really do. And
Yeah,
so
I think you're right.
I think also, Vance, if he has the imprimatur of Trump, that helps him. And also, the other big thing that's shifted in the last several decades is evangelicals and conservative Catholics have come together in and because of the anti-abortion movement. They have that common cause, and they know each other. They work together in the grassroots,
And they're clear that that's their priority.
and that's a priority for a certain segment of Republicans. And so I think all of those things have sort of shifted the landscape. So, there might be some evangelicals that wouldn't vote for Vance because he's Catholic, but I don't think it's that many.
So I did a panel with Jerry Seib at the Dole Institute and on very similar to this topic, and one of the questions he asked, and I will ask you, is the abortion issue fading?
I don't think it's as motivating now since Roe v. Wade has been overturned.
That's how I answered the question.
Again, I'm not talking about any data here. Like, I would have to see some data. It doesn't show up as a top polling issue, but it hasn't really for most people for a long time. I think I've always thought that for a lot of conservatives, it's like a threshold issue. It's not the thing that they're going to say is my number one, get me out to vote. But like, for some people, they just will not vote for someone who doesn't share their view on that.
But now, does it matter on the federal level? It's been overturned. It's on the state level.
Right. And so I think it doesn't matter as much. I do see like rhetoric from the anti-abortion movement about like what's next for the movement, and so I think they're wrestling with that.
They're wrestling with having won.
I think what's that? With having won? Yeah, because it's. In some states there's still an issue they can organize around, but not as many. And the states where it's legal, in many cases it's going to stay legal because of the politics of those states. So it's
Let's
changed.
see if there are any more questions.
Over here, yeah.
This is likely to be a heckling question.
I'm moderating it. Okay, so I started working in immigration reform in the early 2000s when both the evangelical leaders and Catholic bishops in particular were incredibly involved in the politics of immigration reform. And we've really seen that ebb and flow over the years. I feel like it was at the time when Hispanics were the largest growing sector of the evangelical world, and I don't know what explains the Catholics' kind of involvement and then, paying less attention to that, and obviously lately being really out front on the issue. So just would love to see what either of you have to say about the kind of ebb and flow or ups and downs of their involvement on the issue.
PRRI did
You go.
Public Religion Research Institute did a poll, I think, early this year that found that evangelicals were the most supportive of Trump's policies on immigration and of the deportation policy in particular, of any group. So there's that. I know James can speak much more to Catholic, Latino Catholics, but I went to a Latino evangelical church right after the election, and what I heard from folks in that community who had supported Trump was they believe, some of whom were Puerto Rican, so they're American, some of whom were legal immigrants. No one told me they were an undocumented immigrant, but several people said they knew people in the community who were. And by and large, what I heard from everyone there was, we think that Trump is going to deport the criminals, not the bad, not us, not our friends. I would like to go back and see how they feel now. I've been in touch with the pastor, and he said most people in congregation haven't been affected, but I think most of them do have legal status. But I think, the polling, you've probably seen the same polling I have when it comes to Latinos specifically, and I don't think it separates out between evangelical or Catholic, but obviously that was a group that shifted quite a bit toward the Republican Party in 24, and it looks like that potential realignment is not holding, in large part probably because of some of these policies.
Yeah, I think there was a great support for going after criminal aliens, right? So, and I think there's a sense that I'm mostly anecdotal from what I'm reading and hearing, and some stories we did, chasing people into churches in California and denying the Eucharist while they're they're imprisoned being imprisoned in Chicago and in Florida. That they feel like they were lied to. That now it's sort of. I mean, if you listen to what he said, he did say mass deportation, but then he said, oh, it'll just be the criminals. But now obviously there's sort of. It's been a crossover. So I can't, I think I think there was a sense that he wasn't going to go that far, and that he went much further than they felt like he promised that he would. So I think there's a sense of betrayal there among a certain sector. And then there are others who simply, where it doesn't affect them, it's fine. There are too many people here. We should, they shouldn't be here to begin with. And a lot of it, frankly, is rooted in, discrimination and bigotry, from my point of view. I wanted to add one other thing, just completely different than that question, and then we can do another question. But the first president who won on an evangelical, the first evangelical to win and really capitalized on this was Jimmy Carter. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was essentially how Carter won in the South. Was the fact that he was an evangelical Christian, and I think a lot of times the young people in the room may not remember that. That
was 1978. That was just before I was born, but that was at a time when that was really when the moral majority was just starting to build. The Jerry Falwells and Ralph Reeds of the world, and the Christian Coalition later. It was just starting to build power, and so I think arguably, Reagan got elected, and I think with some of their help, and then after that, it was just kind of off to the races.
Yeah, the '76 election for Carter, I think you're right, did propel sort of the beginning of trying, we need to win these back, and I think that's an accurate way to see that.
And they became Reagan Democrats.
Exactly.
This was terrific.
Any more questions?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I'm curious. What's one big? What's one big religion story that you think maybe isn't being covered enough right now, or should be covered better?
Oh, that's a good question. Big religious story. The ones that I sort of, I think there's still some pretty good scandal stories out there. The investigative reporter in me, and I've kind of, you're always going to hear that. I've been admiring Ian Shapiro's stories about the Anglican Church and this is the break-off church where they're having. So these are the break-off ones who they felt like the Anglican Church had become too liberal, and they didn't believe in women priests, and so they broke off, and now they've got multiple sex scandals involving the heads of their churches. How about you? Do you have
I'm curious about groups that are culturally and religiously conservative, but non-white, and therefore traditionally aligned in our current politics with Democrats. So conservative Latinos, conservative Muslims, who would tend to, on some issues, including LGBTQ issues, be more aligned with the Republican Party, but be traditionally seen because of other issues as aligned with the Democratic Party, particularly as those groups grow. What happens with them?
Yeah, the Muslims, in the Supreme Court case in Montgomery County, in Maryland. This
is the transgender education policy case, right? I think there was there were three plaintiffs, as I recall, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, all conservative branches of their faiths. And so, sometimes the conversation gets really elided, like it's, religious people versus non-religious people, right and left, and it's not that at all. And those religious lines can complicate racial and ethnic lines quite a bit.
Apparently we have time.
Yeah, you're booked till 3:30.
So you cannot leave.
Well, I had a question, looking forward, kind of in the crystal ball, because obviously members and money create influence. You see that in different organized groups. And to me, we've done a lot of youth polling where I work, and this tendency sometimes for young people to not trust institutions, not trust, government, not trust organized groups. you need members and you need money to continue to have that influence. We see that with the labor union movement as well, and how that's kind of evolved what they're able to do. So my question is, if young people aren't, maybe ideologically they're lining up somewhere, but they're not lining up in organized religion, what are religious leaders thinking about the future, of their churches and for influence, and especially because we're on a college campus looking at young people and what, we see happening in the future if they're not.
I'm gonna piggyback on that question and say I go to Mass fairly regularly. The churches it's usually at noon or 8 in the morning, usually empty. I went to Mass in Montana and couldn't find a seat, and I was shocked. And so it got me thinking about the future of the Catholic Church, but answer Amy's question.
Where do you go to Mass?
Sometimes St. Matthew's.
Oh, okay. Beautiful church. If you haven't seen it, make sure you go up and you see the marble marking where John F. Kennedy's body laying. It's right there in the thing. I think the future for the Catholic Church is probably in the global South and with Hispanics and Latinos, and I think that's what the Catholic see. This is why this issue that's happening right now is really so imperative for them, and if they don't speak out about it, they're going to lose them. And I know evangelical churches are very aggressive and also pursuing, that demographic as well. For young people, what I see is very conservative. So I see a lot of young Catholics who are drawn to sort of the conservative side. So one of the issues I think the Catholic Church has to deal with is, how they can. This is one of the mandates for Leo, and he knows it. Is how do we bring sort of the church together? How do we bring more unity to it? And he recently allowed a Latin Mass said by Cardinal Burke, at St. Peter's Basilica, and we'll see what happens there. So that's my general take, sort of on the future of the.
So the future of the church is to go back to Latin.
It is not, in my view, and in fact, it was not Pope Francis's view. On the other hand, I go to Mass in Italian at Holy Rosary. Mm-hmm. I go to Mass in Spanish. I usually love the Spanish Mass, and I don't see what's wrong with having a Latin Mass.
I don't, but
I'm not saying the whole church should do Latin.
It's more of if the going back to the Latin Mass is a concession to the conservative idea that the church needs to go back.
Exactly what Pope Francis worried about. And I can tell you, I've been to some Latin Masses where the priest would then, at the homily, implicitly, if not explicitly, criticize Pope Francis, for which I later learned I should have reported that guy to the nuncio and had him excommunicated. Which I learn a little bit about canon law every day, right? That's not something that he could do. Something maybe I could do. I'm sort of whatever. But basically, they had become a lot of these sort of Latin Mass places had become little covens of, basically disloyalty to the papacy, disloyalty to the Vatican, disloyalty to the church. And so when he banned the Latin Mass, I completely understood it. Yet on the other hand, if there's a way to have the Latin Mass without creating these communities that could become basically a schism from the church, then that probably shouldn't be allowed. So I guess I agree.
Dominus vobiscum.
To a certain extent. We're really geeking out on the Catholic stuff here. Sarah's over there.
Well, just more, I can answer it more broadly. Like the trajectory for Christianity in America across the board has been downward for many years. Now, there may be a slight leveling off of that based on the data I've seen the last year or two. It's hard to know. Now, if you look under the hood, it's white Christianity that's really precipitously collapsing, and Latino Christianity is whether Catholic or Protestant, is where the stability and or growth is. And I think the Black church is relatively stable as well, at least not declining as fast as the white church. And people give all kinds of reasons for that. If you look at the data about disaffiliation, people cite, they say that going to church or being part of that community has been damaging to their mental health. They say that they often cite the way their churches talk about LGBTQ people. Sometimes they say their churches are too political. And so where do they go from there, and what does that mean for churches in the future? I mean, anecdotally, I hear about pastors and churches that are frustrated and would like to see fuller pews. At the same time, there seem to be some other trends that are pushing in the opposite direction. That's why I say some of it may be leveling off. There was a Pew poll a few years ago, and I need to call them because I don't think they've done this data analysis again, but there was one poll in 2021 that suggested a small number of people who were pro-Trump were like newly describing themselves as at least evangelical. And then, again, more broadly, it's also important to look at age and gender, and it gets very complicated, but the best analysis I've seen recently is by the Public Religion Research Institute. Melissa Deckman there did an analysis several months ago, and I think she essentially argued that young people are certainly less religious on the whole than older generations, but most of that work is being done by young women. Women are becoming less religious at a much faster rate than young men, and there have been some reports that maybe young men are becoming a little bit more religious, and I think her argument, and I would have to go double check it, but it was essentially that it's less that young men are becoming more religious relative to previous generations, and it's more that they're just a little more engaged with the churches than young women. So, but there's just so much to tease apart there. It depends on if you're talking about race is a factor, gender is a factor, age is a factor.
The data geek in me loves that answer. You read the PRRI is very, very good, and Pew also. I would also look at the Pew studies. You get a lot of great data from both of those.
And AEI has done a little bit of interesting work on religion, religious disaffiliation too. But yeah.
Did anybody pick up the data geek thing over here? We can take one more.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. This is really awesome. So my question is probably for you, but of course, whoever wants to chime in. About the intersection of the papacy and the media, it's something I'm really interested in. So under Francis, I think it was in his first year or maybe two where he was here around DC, super media facing, doing interviews. He has documentaries. He was sitting down with Norah O'Donnell in 60 Minutes. I mean, he was really putting himself out there despite English not being his first language or a language he was particularly strong in. I'm surprised that we haven't seen tons of media presence from Pope Leo. Maybe I shouldn't be, but I am. And I wanted to know your perspective on that. If you expect that will change, if there's a particular reason why he's a little slower to the punch, and if we should expect that the shoe's going to drop.
Yeah, so a very good question. And it's hard to remember what really happened. During the 13 years of the Francis papacy, but his real coming out was not until about now. 6 months in. It was in October of the first year of his papacy where he was asked about a priest allegedly gay in the Holy See, and his answer was, "Who am I to judge?" which kind of exploded, as you'll recall, and sort of made him immediately sort of a global media star. And I think that every pope is sort of learning his own way. I will tell you that he did do one very friendly interview for a book that was, the interviews were primarily in English by an English-speaking bilingual person. It's going to be in Spanish and published in Peru by Elise Allen. And he had, it's kind of like an authorized biography because he could correct it. So he did that interview. He has recently begun doing basically what we would call in the business a doorstep interview, usually on Tuesday nights at Castel Gandolfo. So when I referred to a statement that he made, this is literally the press. So a little bit of the background. Pope Francis was a workaholic, and he never left. He didn't take vacations, and whereas previous popes would go use Castel Gandolfo as their summer retreat, where they would be there for 3 weeks in the summer, or take time off. It's about 30 minutes south of the Vatican, and Leo has decided he's going to go to Castel Gandolfo. And when he arrives, I think it's arrives, not departs. I think it's when he arrives or departs, one or the other, and it's always at night. He's been meeting with the press. He's having essentially a rope line discussion, like when the president gets on Air Force One or Marine One to go to Air Force One. And last night he was asked about the statement that the bishops just issued on immigration, and he gave a pretty long and long for him. It was like 4 or 5 sentences. So this is the beginning. He's been testing the waters. He was also asked about a very controversial matter in which Cardinal Cupich was going to give an award to Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois, who has long supported abortion rights. Cupich was criticized by his fellow cardinals, and the Pope defended Cupich in that regard and gave a statement, and that was also news. So he's actually had a few. He's just you realize that though Francis was from Argentina, his parents were from Italy. So we Italians speak loudly, off the cuff, and with our hands. And so he's a little bit more moderated in terms of sort of how he talks, but he's been outspoken, and I would keep your eye on him next week when he goes on the trip to the council, the 1500 anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. This is his first papal trip. He's going to Turkey, and during that trip, he will probably speak to the press on the airplane, and he'll probably have his first press conference where he will take questions. At least that's the expectation, because that was the pattern that was set, by Francis, and I think that we'll probably see more of him as he's coming along. He's more cautious in terms of what he says, but I think he's starting to come out a little bit more, but we'll see. It's to be determined. We're only 6 months into this papacy, and it'll be fun to watch. And he met with these actors recently, and he put out his list of his favorite films. I don't know if you saw that. The sound.
I didn't see the list.
I saw the 3 I remember were. The Sound of Music, the couple I remember were The Sound of Music, It's a Wonderful Life, and this one was interesting, Ordinary People, set in the Chicago suburbs, but kind of a dark movie, if you've ever seen it.
You mean like Sound of Music?
Sound of Music. Well, you mean the end and the Nazis?
Sound of Music is dark in its own way.
It wasn't all raindrops on roses.
No, it wasn't.
This panel was arranged for that question, so thank you for it. Thank you so much for being here. This was fabulous. We'll do it again. Obviously, we could go another 2 hours. But thanks again to the Berkeley Center and the journalism program and all of you for making this so much fun and so enlightening. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.